All right, so, you know, your textbook starts with the male reproductive system, and we already said the male reproductive system actually has shared structures with the male's urinary system, where the female's urinary system is completely separate from female's reproductive system. But the male's reproductive system is going to have these shared structures. So, oh my gosh. So when we get to the picture, you'll see that if you can't visualize it right now. The prostatic urethra, we know the male has a bladder, the male bladder. And then the urethra, when we think about the male's urethra, it's much longer than the female's urethra, isn't it? And there's some shared things going on, like the prostate gland is releasing its secretions into that prostatic part of the urethra. You have the seminal vesicles and the vulvourethral glands releasing their products to contribute to semen into that urethra. So it's going to have some shared structures, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But anyway, we've talked about sexual reproduction and how species that rely on sexual reproduction, it really offers much more as far as adaptability, I guess you'd say, to survival. It really offers a lot more than species that are cloning themselves. So asexual reproduction, as far as species go, it's just one parent cell dividing, making a copy of itself, and making two new daughter cells that are identical to the parent cell, have the same DNA, are identical. That's asexual reproduction, where there's just one parent. In bacteria, prokaryotes, they have something called prokaryotic fission, where they're dividing, and that's a type of cloning too. But as life evolved on this planet, sexual reproduction was the last thing that actually kind of evolved. You know, we're still evolving, but this is the last thing. And now more species actually use sexual reproduction of the multicelled organisms, use sexual reproduction than any other type of reproduction. And it has evolved that way because it offers so much more protection to the next generations because of the diversity of traits that are found in those populations. So think about it this way. If we had all the same genetic makeup, we had exactly the same genome, and one good parasite came into this room that could kill one of us, it means it could kill what? All of us. But because we have sexual reproduction offers this variety of traits, it offers protection. So life goes on. So make sure you understand that that's the advantage of this. So when we think about this, it's going to require two parents, isn't it? And we've already talked about the idea that you know, the male parent is going to offer sperm and the female parent is going to offer the egg. And when we think about those sex cells, these gametes, and you would want to remember this terminology, gametes are going to be the egg and sperm, right? They're gametes. They're actually going to, once they are fertilized, that first cell we said is called a zygote. So much of this beginning stuff we've had in AMP1, and I hope you remember some of this terminology. You will see it again and be questioned on this again. So we talk about sex organs, and when we think about primary sex organs, they're going to be the gonads, aren't they? So gonads in male are testes, and the gonads in females are what? Ovaries. So those are what we mean when we say primary sex organs. This is going to be where the gametes are being produced in the ovaries for female and the testes for male. When we think about secondary sex organs, they're also very important because without the development of these secondary sex organs, then the eggs and the sperm will never be able to meet. So we've got to think about the health of the secondary sex organs, and much of this is referring to the duct work. You know, a lot of times I'm sure you guys have heard of urologists and physicians that deal with issues like gynecology and, like I said, urologists. You've heard of it called plumbing, right? Well, it's really kind of true. And this plumbing has to be functioning, because if it's not, then it could lead to fertility issues. So we're going to take a look at all of the ducts. We're going to take a look at all the glands that are secreting into the ducts. We're going to look at what's normal and what's healthy, but we'll also talk about some pathology and some disease. Fair enough? Is that good? So this is what we're about to do in the next few days. There's also something referred to as secondary sex characteristics. At puberty, you all have heard, and all of you know, that at puberty, due to the onset of the gonadotropins, which are the hormones that we think about, the sex hormones that we think about, like estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, we know that what really initiates that is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary, and what were those two major gonadotropins from the pituitary that will target the gonads? So, what would you say to that? It's luteinizing hormones and FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Those two hormones from the pituitary gland will target the gonads, and this initiation of the ovaries and the testes starting their reproductive maturity will start to happen, won't it? And you all remember those hormones. Please remember what they do. FSH is going to initiate the development of sperm in males and eggs in females. And LH is going to initiate ovulation in females. This is all, you know this one, right? You know all these. And in males, it's going to initiate testosterone production. So, and all these things are intertwined. But we remember this. Hopefully, this is just a review for you. But these secondary sexual characteristics that are then going to start to develop, and I don't need to tell you all, y'all are much closer to puberty than I am. That's a long time ago for me. But you guys remember, a lot of changes happen, don't they? Just significant changes with these characteristics. Axillary, pubic hair, right? In males, when we think about males, we think about the larynx being affected and the voice deepening, beard and body hair growth that we associate with males, muscle mass. You know, whether, you know, we think about the quality of sexes, but is it true as far as physiology? No. It's very different things happening, and we should celebrate that and understand that there are very different things happening in those respects. And we know that there are a ton of changes that are happening at that time. Those sexual characteristics that are happening are what attract the opposite sex. You know, so that's all part of that. All of this needs to be happening for that. Now there's a typo, and it's not mine, it's actually the textbook, but there is a typo right here. Women, what is our 23rd pair of chromosomes? I ask the women this. What are our 23rd pair of chromosomes? What do we call those individual chromosomes? We call them what? Our 23rd pair. We call them what? Well, we call them sex, but they're X's. Is that what we say? And how many do we have, ladies, at that site? We have 2 X's, don't we? Don't we? Does everybody remember that? We have 2 X's, ladies. Then we have at your 23rd site. What do you have at your 23rd site? An X and a Y. All right, so that's what, in all of our cells, you all think about this, in every one of your cells, the 23rd pair, ladies, you have 2 X's. Gentlemen, your 23rd pair has an X and a Y. So when ladies, when we are making eggs, we can send only one from each of the pair. Y'all remember this from genetics, maybe one. You can only send one of each of the pair to your egg. So you can either send this X or what? You can send this X or you can send the other X. But ladies, do we have anything else to send? No, that's all we have. So every one of our eggs will have an X at that site, right? It might be the X that you got from your mom, ladies, or it might be the X that you got from your dad, but it will be an X, right? Then, when you make sperm, half of your sperm will have the X, and the other half will have the Y, right? So whichever sperm meets the egg, that's going to dictate what the gender of the offspring is. So this is a review, again, but make sure that you remember it. You will be asked questions concerning that. Let's also remember from, is there anybody in here who didn't have genetics in their AMP1? Because I have some new people. You didn't have genetics in there. Okay, so try to set up this. If there's any questions, just stop me. Blair, did you have genetics in there?
I did, but I took your next course, so it's fine.
Okay, so good. So you're all good. You can come up here. You want to? No. Come up here. We'll tag it, team. Come on, Blair. All right. So please jump in though, Blair, if you have something, because that would be great. So we remember it's the male parent that is going to dictate the offspring's gender, right? And we have to kind of understand that. I think I was about to say something else. Oh, and then we also know that on that little Y chromosome, which is pretty unique looking, wasn't it? Remember we did the karyotyping? Y'all remember the karyotyping? You had a patient, you had to do the karyotyping. The little Y chromosome is a very unique little chromosome. And actually, it has on the little Y chromosome an area that holds a recipe for a trait. It's called the SRY region, the sex region of the Y chromosome. And that little recipe that's found on that Y chromosome, I think this is on this next slide, this little recipe is actually going to be active for a very short window of time in the life of that male. And it's during gestation. That little recipe turns on the production of essentially testosterone that floods the fetus. And when it floods the fetus, that if testosterone is there, it's going to end up affecting some of these tissues and how they develop. When we look at a 5 to 6 week embryo, they all look about the same in embryonic development. Do we remember what an embryo is? What are the weeks of an embryo? If you don't, let's make sure we do now. What's the weeks of an embryo? 2 to 8 weeks, right? What is it before 2 weeks? What's that? The first cell's called a zygote, but then, and they're different names, but for the first 2 weeks, it's called a what? One of the words means early cell. Blast, and the part of the word means a fluid-filled sac. What's this? It's a blastocyst. A blastocyst. So a blastocyst is what it's called up to 2 weeks. 2 weeks to 8 weeks is an embryo, and after the 8th week until birth, it's called what? Fetus. Is that right? Fetus. At birth to about 6 weeks is a neonate. So this is just terminology that you use. But look at this 5 to 6 week embryo. You really can't tell the difference. But if that SRY gene is present, and it would only be present if there's a Y chromosome, but if it's present, then that flooding for just that short window of time of testosterone will affect the development of these tissues so that this individual will become a male. In the absence of an SRY, meaning you don't have the Y chromosome, you have 2 X's instead. So in the absence, you become a female. So, we talked about actually females, we become female by default, right? But anyway, we don't think of it that way. So anyway, if we look at some of this embryonic development and how it's happening, by the time birth occurs, you see sort of this beautiful sort of near symmetry, don't you? Where the tissues have actually almost changed positions. But anyway, the male reproductive, the gonads and the ductwork actually have to exit the pelvic cavity, and the females are obviously still in place and there. This is going to be important for development because what we know about sperm is that it has to develop at much cooler temperatures than core temperatures. So this is going to be vital that these gonads of the male actually do descend and descend outside of the core pelvic cavity into the scrotal sac. So when we think about external genitalia and you look at 6 weeks and 8 weeks, it's almost you really can't really tell. But by the time, it's developing, and certainly here near birth, you can see the tissues that become the penis of a male become the clitoris of a female. The tissues that become the labia, what we call the lips, right, the genital lips, the labia become the scrotal sac of a male. So these are analogous tissues that just because of that little few minutes of time of testosterone, this is how they develop very differently. So about 12 weeks up there. And then at birth, obviously, it's usually pretty obvious. We said we're going to look at normal first, but then we'll go back and we'll look at some abnormal things that happen. We talked about a condition where the adrenal glands are hypersecreting during development. Well, I'll talk about one abnormal. So the adrenal glands are hypersecreting in some females. And we know the adrenal glands give us quite a few hormones, don't they? epinephrine, norepinephrine, aldosterone, cortisol, but some androgens. So on some females, when these androgens, testosterone, are being hypersecreted as a little girl is developing, can the little girl have masculinized genitalia? Can it? Yeah, and so that can actually happen, but we see why. Now, orchidism is meaning testes, isn't it? That's referred to as testes. So cryptorchidism is going to be when the testes do not descend. And actually, this is more prevalent than you might think. I do want you to know that word here. About 3% of boys have undescended, and that's fairly common, isn't it? Have undescended testes. But way more than that are going to have what are called floating testes. And so it's really important that, you know, you examine babies when they're born, because what can happen is if you see that the scrotal sac looks empty, or if, you know, one looks empty, one side looks empty, or, you know, and you need to watch this through those first few months of birth, because they can, the testes can be in the scrotal sac and be just floating. So if you weren't being kind of vigilant and always looking, you might not know that the testes is still floating back up into the pelvic cavity. What can happen is that if the testes doesn't come down and doesn't stay down within a certain period of time, the testes can die. So obviously males, just like females, have 2 ovaries. Males have 2 chances, right? So they have, if one dies, you hope that the other one doesn't. But really, you hope that you catch this, because anybody who's at all knowing would know that the scrotal sac looks empty, you know, black and empty. So this is part of pediatric assessment. So when you take kids in, they get their heads measured, don't they? And they get their little weight checked, and then they have all this checked. So the risk is that the testes can die. The risk is that would lead to fertility issues, obviously. Now, the perineum of a male, we don't really talk about the perineum of a male very much, but when we get to the female, we talk a little bit more about this. But it's similar as far as labeling of structures and just perspective. This picture, I want you all to know that this picture is the picture that in this slide. I don't know, I always get emails about what slide was that, and I'm thinking, I don't know, I have it at home. But it's 15, is that right? So you all can get to this and the PowerPoint. This is the slide for the male anatomy that you would want to be responsible for. So this is what, Monday, and it will be this. And I actually can do most, and we could do most of this lecture about male reproduction from this slide. So labeling this slide might seem really crazy to you at this point, but we're about to talk about every single one of these structures. So now we see the bladder. Everybody should recognize that that's the bladder. And leaving from the bladder is this tube that takes urine, exits the body, right? So this is the urethra. Male's urethra are much longer than a female's urethra, right? And then we talk about these shared structures. So that should be obvious. You remember the pubic region of the os coxae? Y'all had to label that, didn't you? What's the os coxae? What is the os coxae? What is that? Thank you. That's all I want. Thank you, Caitlin. Do I look scary because of my duct tape? Do I? So it's the hip bone, right? So you have the right os coxae, the left os, and you had regions that you had to know of the os coxae. The pubic region was one of them. This pubic symphysis is going to be the areas where the right and left os coxae join there. There's a fibrocartilage pad. Thanks, Kate. Okay. So some of these things you actually see, but let's go ahead and start with the testes. So this is a mid-sagittal section, isn't it? So what we're looking at here is actually like the right testes. That's fine. You know, there's another one. So anyway, but we'll look at the testes, and we know that this is going to be the male primary sex organ. This is going to be where sperm are going to be produced. This is going to be where testosterone production is going to be coming from. And I really kind of do want you all to realize that what you're seeing in this illustration is the duct work that would take sperm on its way. But do realize that these gonads have to have blood supply, don't they? So they have to have arterial blood supply, capillary beds, venules and veins returning blood back after it's delivered oxygen, right? So there's a lot more here coming through this inguinal canal than just this duct work. There's all the blood supply, there's nerve supply. This area is very sensitive, isn't that right? So, you know, there's a ton of very important structures moving through the inguinal canal region. And we talked about if that doesn't close up, then the testes can float, right? But it can be, if they do decide to pull the testes down and do some stitching to hold it down so it doesn't continue to float, you can imagine that you want somebody knowing what they're doing. Because if they do it too tight, what could it do to the testes? It could strangle the testes, and you have some of the structures die, right? And this is also the issue that happens with inguinal hernias. When people have inguinal hernias, you've got part of the intestines that are slipping down into that canal, and that would be strangling some of these very important structures, right? So just realize it's not just this duct work that's going through here. There's a lot of other important structures. So here we've got, let's just assume everything's working well, and we've got, you know, puberty has happened. And so with the onset of puberty, there's going to be ejaculations that have viable sperm. For males, it's considered the puberty. They have hit puberty when the ejaculations have living sperm. There's ejaculations way before then, but when there's living sperm there, then they're considered to be you know, puberty has been hit. So about 10% of semen is sperm, about roughly 10% of semen. So if you thought that all of the semen was sperm, that would be wrong. That would be a lot of sperm. So anyway, but about 10% is going to be, and then the 90% is going to be the fluid that helps to propel it, the fluid that's helping to nourish it and supply energy that's going to help, hopefully, one little sperm out of all of them get to where they need to go, and you know where it needs to go, and where are they trying to go? Where's sperm trying to get to? An egg. Thank you. And chocolate gland. Is everybody awake? Okay, all right, so anyway, we've got this happening here, and then we're going to actually see a cross-section of a testes in a little bit, and if y'all have male rats today, you can take the testes and also dissect them if you end up having a male rat. But anyway, so the sperm are going to have to mature here, and then they kind of get stored in this very coiled, you can't see it from here, but microscopically, this is a very coiled little ductwork called the epididymis. And they're stored there until they finish off this maturation process, and the sperm will then be ready to be propelled. Look how far sperm have to go. Like, you feel sort of sorry for them a little bit, right? This is a muscular surrounded tube because there's going to be peristaltic contractions. What does peristaltic movement suggest? Wave-like movement that's actually moving something in what? One direction, right? So peristaltic contractions of this. This is called the ductus deferens. It's also sometimes referred to as the vas deferens, V-A-S. If it gets cut, and intentionally, hopefully not through trauma, but intentionally gets cut and banded off, what is that procedure called? Vasectomy. That's exactly right. This can be done in a urologist's office. You can actually palpate and feel this little duct, and it's a very quick procedure. Of course, it's both sides, but and I don't know if you have anybody that would let you try to do this, feel this. But you can feel this, and what they do is kind of palpate it close to the surface, make a very small little incision, pretty superficial incision, cut this, and there's different ways they can band it. Depending on the procedure they use, sometimes people choose to have reversals. of this later on, and I don't know the percentages. I'm sure they're different between each urologist that's performing that. But this is an in-office procedure, a pretty, you know, I say minor because I don't have any testes, but considered a pretty minor procedure with really kind of low risk for someone as far as wanting to use birth control this way. So anyway, that's what that's called, vas deferens. So you've got sperm being produced here, being stored in the epididymis, being ejaculated through this ductus deferens that, look, has to go all the way back up. And there's, this is not exactly correct in how it's really showing you this, but anyway, it just sort of goes behind this area. And then it's going to join with the other side, but this is going to be the ejaculatory duct. And the seminal vesicles are secreting secretions that contribute to sperm. This prostate gland, if you look at this ivory-looking walnut-shaped gland, this has been cut for you, but it's really, if you think about like a walnut, the urethra is going right through that. So it's this prostate is completely surrounding the urethra here. So this is why this is referred to as the prostatic urethra. This is secreting about 30% of semen, seminal vesicles secreting its part, and then the bulbourethral glands, if you look, they're also secreting to support the function of sperm. And then this is the urethra, right? Do I have any questions so far? So you see we've actually labeled a lot of these structures. You can see why a rectal exam is actually pretty useful in figuring out if the prostate's enlarged, because you see how close they are. So palpating that is pretty useful in evaluating the prostate gland. Do you have any questions so far? All right. So you'll notice that much of the root of the penis is actually internal. And then there is the penis itself is external. This is the tactile sensory organ for the male, just like the clitoris is for the female. Again, they are analogous tissues and an embryo. And depending on which hormone gets there, if the testosterone gets there, these tissues become a penis. There's erectile tissue here. At the end of the penis, there is what people refer to as the head of the penis is actually more accurately called the glans. Now, this does not have a D on it. It's just referred to as the glans of the penis. This is what people call the head of the penis. There is also tissue that protects this glans that is incredibly sensitive and probably needs protection. It's called the prepuce. This is what people refer to as foreskin. What procedure is it that removes the foreskin? What is that procedure called? It's called a circumcision. Exactly. It's called a male circumcision. Why is that done?
Maybe prevent cancer in the future and infection in women.
So to prevent cancer of the male?
I've heard in for the glands, something about cancer out there at one time for the foreskin, and they have it removed, and something about females, when you have sex with women, you don't pass on germs because it's like less sanitary or something. That's just the way we kind of grew up.
Okay, so that's all was some school of thought that's absolutely been debunked.
Old school.
Old school.
Religion.
Yeah.
And religion is what we sort of now think of as being the major reason that circumcisions are done. You know, so all three of the major religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, these have sort of pushed this forward as a proof that, you know, you're going to raise this child as male and whatever. So when we look back at writings, we can see that the major religions have really kind of kept this thing going. But the fact is, there's no reason to do this. There's no medical reason to do this. And all the studies show that. So males that are not circumcised are not less clean. I want everybody in this room to hear that. and then I want every woman in this room, because it's women, I want every woman in this room to realize that nothing's cheesier than the labial folds. Janet's laughing because is it true? True. You know, so females learn with those labial folds how to properly keep hygiene, and males do too that are circumcised, that are not circumcised. This tissue, there's no medical reason to remove this tissue. It has been removed just because of norms and just because of, you know, whatever. So I think I don't think it is changing. Right now, there's less males in the United States being circumcised than ones not being circumcised. So the trend is changing. Part of what's causing it to change is that for this procedure now to be done for your male babies, you're going to pay out of pocket. It's not going to be part of your health care thing. So you're going to pay out of pocket because we know there's no medical reason for this to be done. And it's really hard to change norms, isn't it? It's really hard to change what you think of as what is considered normal. Now, some of the issues about the foreskin being able to harbor normal flora that might lead to increased risk of sending something to partners, that would only be in people who didn't really know proper hygiene and or whatever. It's not considered to be a significant enough number that it would mean actually removing of healthy tissue. Because this is healthy tissue and it's protecting the glands, and so whatever. Anybody have any thoughts about this? Okay. How many of you have heard of female circumcision? Charity. Raise your hands high if you've heard of female circumcision. There's no such thing as female circumcision. Well, there is, but it doesn't happen. Female circumcision would mean, if there really was such thing as female circumcision, it would mean that the clitoral hood, just that little piece of tissue over the clitoral hood, was removed. That would be the same as the prepuce, because that's called the prepuce too, be removed. But in female circumcision, that's not happening. What you all have heard of is female circumcision, and it just makes my heart beat harder just talking about it. It's mutilation. What you all have heard of is female mutilation. I want people to stop calling it female circumcision because it's not. Female circumcision would mean just removing the clitoral hood. You know, many women pierce that. You know, whatever. Do what you want to that. But that's not what female circumcision is, what people call that. It's female mutilation. And that procedure, they remove that, but then they remove the entire clitoris. I want you to hold up your little fingers. Everybody in this room, hold up your little fingers. Got them up? I'm not going until you've held up your little fingers. Everybody. The clitoris is mostly deep, right? That entire clitoris gets removed. There's an open hole there. The labia, you can put your fingers down now. I just want you to picture this. That entire, if it were truly female circumcision, only this prepuce would be the clitoral hood. If males had what female circumcision is called, the entire penis, including the root, would be removed. Don't call it female circumcision. Call it female mutilation. The labia, the inner labias, the hairless lips of the genitalia are removed. And sewing down, it happens there. It is a procedure that has cost many lives because of the trauma and the shock that happens after the procedure. And then the ones that don't die from the shock of the procedure, there are many that die afterwards because of infection. The ones that don't die then have a much higher risk if they do make it to young adulthood. They get these women who get to, marry, have children. They die from urinary tract infections, much higher incidence of urinary tract infections, stillbirths, and to even have sex, they have to be cut with a blade first to have sex. So no, let's don't call it female circumcision. Let's just stop calling it that. Do you all know that there's more than 150 million women alive today that have been mutilated? If you ever work in urban areas long enough, in ERs and whatnot, you will see a woman who has been mutilated, and she will require incredibly extensive care when they come in because they have been mutilated. So that's just the ones we know. The whole practice itself is considered to be so hush-hush and secret. We know that there's way more women out there that have been involved with that. And that it is not just one religion. So if you think it is predominantly Islam, but it is not exclusively. So it's not just one religion, it's not just one culture. It seems to be kind of widespread, sort of like the male circumcision, but very different than male circumcision. Yes.
Just a little tidbit. Unfortunately, I've studied this before.
Okay.
Unfortunately, like with
5 minutes. Thank you. I had told them. Thank you.
Unfortunately, with our males, we thankfully they have the little their circumcision done at babies. Unfortunately, the mutilation happens when girls are well of age and very unaware. They don't have any anesthetics. They're literally dirt down, and they're between, I think, what the ages of 7, at least 7 to 12.
Yeah.
Once they become of reproductive age, this happens. They
Right.
have no kind of numbing. They're just kind of.
That's why many of them die of shock in the initial procedure, because it is done supposedly quickly,
Okay.
but the shock of the procedure has killed many of them. I've heard of even younger ages than 7, but you're right, it's not as babies, it's a little older. And then there's some women that even after puberty choose to have it done because they're so shunned, because the whole community knows that they haven't, so they get shunned. If they haven't been, they're considered to be unclean. Some of the literature that supports this, that says that, remove the male part of the female, and that's, kind of the literal interpretation that's happening. So anyway, yes, and Blair?
Is the birthing process different because her internally being cut?
Yeah, so these tissues are very, I want to say malleable, but the vagina, is able to expand, but so is the perineum, this area. But when it's been cut and sewn together, this is going to be a split raw wound that is going to happen. So it's just going to add so much more. The birth process itself is going to be impaired, but also the woman afterwards. So you were talking about stillbirth, you mean, like that whole birthing process. Yeah, I don't know why it adds some other reasons why it does, but they do know women who have this mutilation have much higher incidences of stillbirths. So we're about to have this thing happen, so we'll just, this fire thing. Any other comments? Yes.
What's the point of it?
The point of it's, you might, and y'all, I don't want you all to take this the wrong way, but kind of the point of this is the same point of why we do male circumcisions here. People think that's what, it's just been ingrained that that's the normal thing to do. It's really hard to change those practices. When we go into those societies, it's not the men that are wanting to keep that going. It's the women, because in their heads, they think their worth, their value, they're going to be considered impure. If you thought that your little girl would be shunned and that she would not ever have a chance to have a partner, to be married, would you maybe do it, Casey? Yeah, but you're saying that from your living in your perspective. If that truly was something you were facing with your little girl, it's a really tough decision to have. So what would you say?
I feel like find something different.
They don't
have a choice, and this is like these choices. I will tell you this though. If you do any research on this, you'll find out that it's not socioeconomic groups like poor people or uneducated people. There was a family that came from Somalia that actually was in our Georgia, not the other Georgia, but our Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia. They both had PhDs. The husband said, "I don't want my little girls circumcised." The mother wanted them circumcised. And they were having an incredible battle over this. And she wanted to take, because they couldn't find physicians in this country to do it, but she wanted to take her little girls back home and have them circumcised. So I think at the end of that documentary, I think he won, at least as far as that, at that date, he had won that battle because he had remembered his little sister and that she'd almost died and the pain that she endured from it. He remembered that. His wife didn't remember having it done. And she considered her genitalia to be normal, and she didn't understand how it probably affected her sexuality, whatever, because what you don't know, you don't miss, right? So she wasn't understanding that, and she thought it was truly something that, let's please don't judge other people's culture, because honestly, when you think about male circumcision, it's kind of ridiculous. Removing healthy tissue for no reason. And I know there's some women that I saw the eyes that y'all, well, that's the way it's supposed to look. That is exactly what's keeping female mutilation going. If there's a woman sitting in here right now that says males are supposed to look like that and circumcised thing, that's exactly what's keeping female mutilation going. Please open your minds, do some research, please. Please, because it is no different. It is no different, that prejudice you have. Women that are keeping that going.
You ever heard of TED Talk? You should make one.
I should have ready to listen to that.
We need to watch it.
All right, so we're back to this, and again, we're kind of doing the most of this lecture on this slide, but this will help you hopefully too with your anatomy that you'll do, and also any kind of lecture quiz questions. So I think I'm about done with looking at this. So we really talked about a lot of these structures. So now these structures don't seem. So this is just a region. So this is more like the region, and if you did a dissection of this, you see this is the seminal vesicle. So it's almost like an ampoule holding this fluid, if you will. And so this is going to be released.
And then the pubic symphysis.
Yeah, that's just where the pubic bones, the pubic regions of the os coxae meet, right? So, okay, let's go ahead and make sure I haven't really forgotten too much of what we need to get through on this. As far as the testes go, we said we'd kind of remember that if you did a little bit look into the testes here, you guys remember that FSH is going to be targeting this region for the production of sperm. And if you look at these retested areas, this is going to be little microscopic ducts. Do you see that? So as these sperm are starting on their process of being made, they're going to move through this ductwork and then eventually, be sent to this epididymis. And like I said, this is a really coiled, supposedly if you took and uncoiled this, it is incredibly long. So anyway, but the sperm are staying in here for a bit. This is one of the reasons why, if somebody has a vasectomy, they get told that after the vasectomy, they have to, wait like 6 weeks, practicing birth control in those 6 weeks, come back and have a specimen given at that time where there's no viable sperm. There are a lot of people, though, I think, who don't follow those rules. And maybe what they don't understand is that there could be sperm in these ducts that actually are kind of hanging out and can make it through that period of time. So how many people have actually known anybody who had a child after a vasectomy, shortly after a vasectomy? Right, exactly. So that can happen. So people should follow the rules and directions, right? So anyway, so this is looking at that. And then if we did a coronal section of these structures, it's also, some of you might want to look at this coronal section just to sort of see how these structures look here. The dartus muscle, the muscles that control the scrotal sac, are going to keep the testes at just the perfect at the perfect position from the core temperature, because in very hot weather, the sperm can only develop at cooler temperatures. So in hot weather, do the testes need to hang lower? They do. And in colder weather, they need to be brought back up. So we have the cremaster muscles and the sarx muscles that are going to help with that, making sure, and I think everybody kind of understands that. There's some men who find out that they're not essentially infertile, but they're having difficulty conceiving with their partners, and one of the first things they do after they do a seminal analysis and find out, no, you've got plenty of viable sperm and you've got plenty of sperm and everything's looking pretty good. But they'll ask about practices like what kind of underwear the men wear, what kind of clothing, because if their clothing's too tight or they're have those kind of underwear, whatever, or if they're hot tubbing. I had 2 doctor friends. They were both plastic surgeons. But anyway, her name was Julie. Her husband, I can't remember his name. But they were trying to conceive, right? These are doctors. They're trying to conceive. And they're having a really, really difficult time. They were hot tubbing almost every night. He was killing his little sperm, So he was reducing the numbers enough. So they stopped that. And guess what? They shortly thereafter got pregnant. So anyway, it's important that these muscles work and that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing as far as keeping that temperature where it needs to be. So this is where you see this. I don't know what else. I just think this is not for me because I'm not this poetic, but I kind of like the idea that the scrotum is called the pendulous pouch. That was your textbook. That was not me. That's what it says in that. Anyway, so this is another great picture to look at because we looked at a mid-sagittal section, but this would be an anterior aspect and just looking at these important structures so you can see this. We talked about the male urethra, and we understand that this is one of the reasons that men don't have as many urinary tract infections as women do. The male urethra is colonized with normal microbial flora, microbes, but the microbes that colonize a male's urethral opening are actually the same that's on skin, so staphylococci, streptococci, some Corynebacterium. They're skin flora. Women in the periurethral orifice area, in that area, it's very different kinds of microorganisms, and women's urethras are much shorter, and it's much more likelihood that women are going to have part of their normal flora microbes that have flagellum, and those flagellum help that to move on. So I think we had talked about that. It used to be that people would say, oh no, we need to keep male circumcision because it reduces, this is why men are having less urinary tract infections than women do, because so many men are circumcised. That has nothing to do with it. So it really doesn't. Now, people do, little boys that need to be taught hygiene, but all do. So I want to talk a second about males at puberty. Females at puberty get a lot of information about breast examination, and every cycle that you have, you get told to do monthly breast exams, and that's type of thing, right? And you get told that if your vaginal secretions change, and they do throughout the month because of hormones, but if they change in a way that you're not familiar with, to go see about something because something could be wrong. So you get told a lot of stuff. Males don't a lot of times, and they need to be, because testicular cancer is a pretty common cancer in young males from 10 to 30 years of age. So in young males, this is something that can happen, and it's very curable if it's caught early. But that's the key, is that it's caught early. Why do people die from cancer? Is it because of the cancer itself, or is it because in that local region, or is it because what? It metastasizes. It metastasizes to other areas. So metastatic cancer is what causes deaths, and this is why young boys should also be told at puberty if they notice any nodules, if they notice any tenderness, any soreness that can't be accounted for, like they didn't have an athletic injury or something. But they need to get it checked, and they need to get it checked as soon as possible, because that happens. Now there's also in older men, what do we know happens with the prostate? So prostate cancer, if a man lives long enough, and now lifespans have really greatly increased, haven't they? If men live long enough, they will develop prostate cancer, some type of prostate cancer. but not all prostate cancers are created equal. So depending on the evaluation of the prostate cancer, if a man is past like 70, I'm going to use 75 just as a whatever, but around that area, and start with prostate cancer, it is not likely that cancer would ever be what causes their death. It's so slow growing, it would never be what's causing their death. Younger men that develop prostate cancer, this is typically a more aggressive type, and then they, obviously treatment would end up being more aggressive with that particular type of cancer. Fair enough? So prostate, but we also know that it's natural for men as they age for their prostate to actually just enlarge as well. And so when this prostate enlarges, it is going to be putting pressure on the urethra. So men can have urgency issues or even incontinence type of problems. And so, have to get up, you hear about older men having to get up and go to the bathroom several times at night. So this is a natural part of aging for men. It can be. There are medications that can, for a better word, shrink the prostate a little bit and maybe give some relief with that. All medications have side effects, but there are ways to address that for men, and this is just part of males aging. Any questions for me about the prostate gland? No? Okay. I was just trying to remember if I forgot something I'd like you to know about. So younger men, all men, testicular cancer, but it's especially younger men. And then we usually think of prostate in older men cancer, right? Sometimes males can have prostatitis. So this is going to be inflammation of the prostate gland, and it's usually bacterial. But can you see how hard it would be to get a sample from there? So oftentimes they're not going to actually get samples from the prostate gland. They'll just go ahead and treat with broad spectrum antibiotics and hope that they're going to end up covering whatever might be causing that particular situation. Getting a sample from the prostate gland can be painful. It's obviously pretty invasive. It can be painful. And sometimes the results are, we're not even sure if we're putting the cultures in media or in environments that we are getting everything out that could be there. So a lot of times they're just going to choose to treat with broad spectrum antibiotics. Okay. All right. I'll talk about sexually transmitted diseases maybe when we finish the female thing. Do we understand? Are most sexually transmitted diseases symptomatic or asymptomatic? And you should just, as a rule of thumb, understand most sexually transmitted diseases are asymptomatic. They're asymptomatic. And depending on the etiology, the cause of the sexually transmitted disease, we understand that they carry a risk of infertility, right? And this is both in males and females. And this is why when sexual activity begins, which is very natural and normal, and you want to see happen, when it begins, though, people should take the responsibility to have routine screenings. And the routine screening should be routine. Doesn't have to be any kind of symptom, because we understand that most are asymptomatic, right? All right. So I had talked about, this is a transverse section of penis, so you guys can actually see this, these tissues and erectile tissues. This is the urethra transected there. And their urethra should be at the tip of the glands, but sometimes it's actually not. It can be in other areas, and so we most often see it. It's called hypospadias. Have y'all ever seen that or heard of that? Where the opening isn't at the end of the urethra, it can be tucked way underneath. And so typically, depending on how severe it might be, they are going to do surgical repair. Well, they're going to do surgical repair anyway, but what's going to depend on when they do it is how severe it is, right? So this is just a developmental thing that happens in utero, and it's going to be obvious at birth that this has happened, and then, like I said, they can repair it. So that's going to be, that term's going to be somewhere in your hypostasis. Yep. So puberty we talked about. It's going to be the onset of the viable sperm. But men have, climacteric is referring to male menopause. Do men have menopause? Go through menopause? We kind of don't think of it. We don't call it that, do we? Because men are, once they have the first viable sperm at puberty, unless something happens to them, they will be fertile the rest of their life, even if they live to be 100 plus. You know, saw some eyebrows raise up right then. I'm not saying it's suggested, but I just say they are. So there's so much information now about older fathers though, and older mothers, and so there's just a whole lot of information going on about that now. A lot of things being discovered. I wish I could stay up with all of it that's coming out, but one of the last most interesting things I heard about was this idea that what a male is doing, and that includes eating, partaking of legal and illegal, whatever, 3 months prior to when they make the sperm that will end up meeting the egg, affects that sperm and affects that zygote and affects that neonate. So, you know, when we talk about us being the guardians of our genetics, females, and I think it's often been pushed on the females, you know, because we have not only making the egg, so half of that zygote, but we have that incubation period of time. So I think a lot of times women have had that all on their shoulders, but we do understand that what men are doing 3 months prior. Isn't that just interesting to think about? So, but with that being said, I do want you to know that men do go through a type of menopause. So when that actually happens, and I'm not sure where it is on the slides, but when that happens, there's going to be a change in FSH and LH. So men can have some of the same symptoms that women have. The difference in women is we're going to not be fertile anymore, right? We're going to stop producing eggs. But with men, they have the feelings of suffocation. Sometimes they'll feel like they're having a heart attack, so they come in. Now, what do you rule out? A heart attack. So you always rule that out. But if you've got this patient who is exhibiting this for quite a period of time, and you realize that, you know, they hadn't had anything like this before, then really an endocrinologist might want to check and look at these hormone levels and just let them know, hey, this is probably going to resolve for you. Your body's going to acclimate to this, and these feelings aren't going to probably stick around too long. Same thing that women do when they go through this. So anyway, adolescence is a weird medical definition. Adolescence means that you're in adolescence, and it ends when a person reaches their full adult height. So ladies, for that, most of us, that was 12. But for most men, that's going to be in their late teens or 20s, early 20s, right? So that just means they stay adolescents longer and adolescents longer. No, I don't know. That's a weird definition. I don't even ask you about it because I do think it's kind of, it's not how I think we use adolescence in other classes. But anyway, all right. Testosterone, we know, is our libido hormone. So testosterone is what actually gives sex drive. And I think we understand that the effects of testosterone are widespread. We talked about it hitting the larynx, muscle mass, these secondary sexual organs, hair, scent, sebaceous oil glands. It stimulates erythropoiesis. So we said that we understand that males have a higher hematocrit, just a normal higher range of hematocrit, right? All right. And then we also talked about inhibin. We said that inhibin is actually going to regulate FSH. Can men have too many sperm? I think I'd already introduced this to y'all. Men can have too many sperm, and that can actually make them infertile. So that composition of semen needs to be kind of just right, just like we talk about everything else being just right. If the percentage is way too high, then actually it ends up hurting all of the sperm. And I think I've actually given you numbers about how many sperm are in a cc, an ml. So y'all know in 1 teaspoon, how many mLs are there? In 1 teaspoon, this is apothecary equivalencies. How many ml cc's are in 1 teaspoon? 5. Thank you. It's 5. So I want y'all to think of a teaspoon I'm not going to make you hold it, but you're thinking about a teaspoon and what a teaspoon of liquid would look like. There's 5 mLs, same as the cc, but ml in there. If you took 1/5 of that teaspoon, 1/5, you can have 50 to 120 million sperm in that 1/5 of a teaspoon. Is everybody picturing that? So you're thinking 50 to 120 million sperm. So now you're thinking about an ejaculatory event. And you're thinking about how many sperm is normal in that. It's a lot. How many need to get to the egg? 1. But that's just crazy to think about, isn't it? Isn't it? But do realize that some men are infertile because they have too many sperm. And it means that the inhibit is not doing what it needs to do in regulating the numbers of sperm. So that's what inhibit does. It regulates FSH, lowering FSH. You know, FSH causes sperm to be produced along with testosterone, but FSH does that. So we get that. When we think about these changes of testosterone, you can see what some of these ranges are. I don't end up asking you about that, but I do want you to understand that men do also go through a type of climacteric. And ladies, as far as sperm production in men, they will produce almost like a daily cycle too. So where women are on a 28-day average cycle, we talk about it 28 days, even though some women are 32, some women are 24. But we talk about an average 28-day cycle for women who aren't doing anything to affect their reproductive, whatever. It's usually average 28 days. Men are on a 24-hour cycle. So that whole surging of hormones happens to men. So where women stay in those areas a little bit longer because it's 28 days. So sometimes women get, and sometimes women are really sensitive to the changes in the hormone cycles. So some women truly do have, they have a change in sleep patterns. They'll have a change in, and when I say moods, that's not being critical. That's a change in biochemistry, right? So they do, and they are sensitive to it. So it affects how they feel and affects how they act, and they're in them for a much longer period than men are. But men are in them every day. It just doesn't last as long. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay. Nobody was saying much to that, but all right. So impotence, you guys know that this means erectile dysfunction. And just because somebody has erectile dysfunction does not mean that they're not fertile. They can still be fertile. So they're still able to ejaculate and still have viable sperm. So there are a lot of different things that can cause that. Now, do we remember what mitosis and meiosis is? If you don't, make sure you do now. Mitosis is how cells divide, making copies of themselves, right? For mitosis, the zygote undergoes mitosis. Then there's 2 cells. Those 2 cells undergo mitosis. Then there's 4. For 2 weeks, they do that mitosis, and it's called a blastocyst during that time. For 2 to 8 weeks, it's called an embryo. Growth. It's just so amazing how much growth is happening in 9-month time. That's mitosis, growth, regeneration, repair. One cell makes a copy of its DNA and becomes 2 cells, and those cells are a type of clone of the first cell. They really are. And so that's mitosis. Meiosis only happens in the gonads, and it only happens in the germ cells of the gonads. And that germ cell undergoes that one germ cell undergoes 2 divisions. And after the second division, there's 4 cells. And those 4 cells are not at all like the first cell, not at all like. So the germ cells produce in males, a germ cell is going to end up going through meiosis, which is 2 cell divisions that end up getting you to 4 cells. You will need to know that. Get you to 4 cells. And those 4 cells are not at all like the original cell. They are not at all like. They have half the number of chromosomes that the original cell had. They have half the number of chromosomes. We said a germ cell has got a diploid number of chromosomes. You remember that word, diploid? Diploid is going to mean that it has a pair of each of the homologs, right? So it's got 2 of each of the pair. but the gametes only have one of each of the pair. They have half the number of chromosomes. So in a normal situation, you're going to go from a germ cell that for men that have 46 chromosomes, but those numbers are going to be cut in half for the 4 gametes that form, and they're going to be haploid numbers of chromosomes, right, in those gametes. And do y'all remember this? Those of you who didn't have, are you feeling okay, Sarah? Okay, so that terminology is okay. All right. And what we said happens, and these pictures do a pretty good job of this, because they're just showing you, the pairs of homologs. They're just showing you 2 pairs. How many pairs do humans normally have? 23. But we're just seeing 2, right? And we're seeing that one of your homologs of this pair came from your mom, and its matching partner came from your dad, maybe holding different traits. If it's different traits, it's called heterozygous for that trait, right? If they're holding the same information for that trait, it's called what? Homozygous, right. So we're just seeing 2 pairs. We understand that there's 23. But what happens in meiosis is not just that you get this shuffling of information as far as like independent assortment, but you're really getting this crossing over that happens too. So what ends up happening at the end is that the 4 cells, these 4 cells that are the end product after 2 divisions, neither of these 4 are like the germ cell, because for one thing, it has half the number, but none of them are like each other. I want you to think about a little boy you know who might be in puberty and might be, might be in puberty, so producing sperm. And then I want you to think of the oldest man that has maybe had injuries or whatever, is producing sperm. And think about all the ejaculations in a male's life. And think about that teaspoon and how many sperm are in 1 ml. And now I want you to realize that no 2 sperm a man makes in his entire lifetime, no 2 will be alike genetically. Is that just crazy to think about? Did y'all just hear that? If you were hearing that, then it should have kind of blown your mind up. But that's actually true. No 2 are exactly alike. And this, Mendel told us a lot of this and understanding a lot of this. But anyway, enough about that. Spermatogenesis means the beginning of making sperm. So we know we go from this one cell that ends up being a cell that's going to undergo meiosis, and from after 2 divisions, how many cells do you have functioning? How many? In meiosis, you start with 1 cell. The cell makes a copy. Its DNA makes, the chromosomes are copy DNA, right? Homologs separate from each other in that first division. So after the first division, you have 2 cells. Those 2 cells have a haploid number of chromosomes. But the chromosomes are in duplicate, the DNA is in duplicate form. So then the 2 cells divide, losing their duplicate copies, and now there's a haploid number of chromosomes in those 4 cells, right? And they're not the same. And it's going to be 4 functioning sperm. This is a very different kind of little price meiosis in females, but it's a little bit different in females. Because do we need 4 eggs every month, ladies? No. We only need 1. Meiosis is occurring in females, and 4 eggs will be formed in females, or not 4 eggs, 4 cells. But 3 of the cells will not get what they need to survive. Only 1 of them will get what it needs, and that will be the egg. But in males, all 4 can be functioning. So males have the ability to make tremendous numbers of sperm. This is talking a little bit about where this fluid, how much fluid is expelled during orgasm, and then, where this fluid is kind of coming from. Components of the semen, and this would be important. What is fructose? Phenenzinose, what is it?
Sugar.
It's a sugar, and what do we know sugars give us? Which our cleanest, quickest source of fuel is carbohydrates, right? What do they give us? Energy. So fibrinogen is actually going to form this clotting that's going to happen and then it's going to be acted upon almost immediately, start to break down and liquefy. But this is probably a process that just happens to, and not probably, it does. It protects, because if ejaculations happen, you know, if you think about it, happen in the vagina is a harsh environment for sperm. You know, it's not friendly to sperm. The vagina is, you might think it is, but it's not. So the secretions aren't. So that whole clotting thing that happens initially is to protect, but then it's going to have to liquefy so that the sperm will be able to move out as quickly as possible. And there's only a short window of time each month that a woman's cervix is going to be open to sperm. And it's just going to be a narrow little thread of thinning mucus that allows sperm to move up for a very short period of time in a monthly cycle for a woman. Prostaglandins and semen actually start female contractions. So these prostaglandins have been synthesized in a lab, and we use them sometimes to help women to go into labor. If you've ever known a woman who was late in her gestation and they wanted to soften the cervix and maybe to initiate labor, you hear that they go in and they have this, when I say, you know, a tampon just means something that's stopping the flow, right? But it looks like a tampon, but they insert this to soften, and it's the prostaglandins from the males. It's a synthetic version of it that helps to soften the cervix and maybe to get that cervix ready to initiate labor. What's the old wives' tale about women who want to go ahead and go into labor? What are they supposed to do? Have sex. Are Janet and I the only ones that have heard these old wives' tales? You're supposed to have sex because seminal fluid, can help you, can help you get there, right? So anyway, and this is stabilizing the pH because the vaginal secretions in women are, and when I say they're acidic, I think people think of like acid. They're not, but it's lower. It's lower. And does that protect women, right? It protects women. So that's a normal thing for women's vaginal secretions to be slightly acidic, but that's very dangerous for sperm. So this is going to help to stabilize the pH for the sperm right there until the sperm can make their exit and hopefully go in the right direction. Many of them go the wrong direction. But anyway, I'm not going to really go over male sexual response. I feel like that's almost a different class than this one, and I'm not going to spend much time on this. But we do understand that, you know, these organs are very tactile, sensitive organs, and should be, because there requires an erection to be able to deposit the sperm where it needs to go. So when you think about these triggers, they don't have to be tactile, do they? It doesn't have to require touch. You can think about something and become aroused. So anyway, that has to happen. And orgasm and ejaculation, when you think about what those actually mean, they really aren't the same, and they can occur separately. That can cause problems for people. Again, that's not this class, but maybe another class. But anyway, this is what they actually mean. And for men, there's going to be this resolution period that actually occurs. For some men, it's minutes. For some men, it's much longer. So it's just individual and how that happens, where, you know, women can have multiple orgasms. This is going to be a little bit of a difference here, but that's it. So that's males. Do you have any questions for me? Because guess what we're going to do Monday? Monday, we're going to look at females, right? We're going to start that process. You guys, this is a 3D model. If I were y'all, I maybe look at this during the lab time today. I need to see if I can switch out so we can go into the lab and do those dissections for the rats. We can have people, there's a pretty big group, and I have lots of rats, so I would want my group to be bigger than 3, okay? And if there's somebody in your group that's, you know, wants to do most of the crowding, you know, maybe y'all can share off responsibilities. Let me tell you really quickly before we get in there and it gets crazy, confusing. You're going to get out your dissection trays. You're going to get your blades. You're going to have gloves. Everybody's going to wear gloves. People are going to use caution in cutting. Is that right? Some of the things that happen, you know, these are rats. Some people ask me how big they are. Well, they're pretty big. The tails are, you know, can be in your way. So maybe it's your rat, it's your group. You can do what you want, but you might want to remove the tail. All right, and then honestly, you might want to. It's going to end up kind of breaking the little legs to sort of open up this abdominal cavity. I want you to palpate first your little rat, and you'll see that their thoracic cavities are much tinier than proportion than ours. Their abdominal cavities are soft, right? So you're going to be, what you should do is this wide incision, then invert it wide at the bottom, superficial. Try to remove the skin and muscle, top muscle layer, so that you're seeing the little tiny stone. Now, but when you get to the abdomen, if you go too deep, you're going to cut into the intestines, and it's going to be a mess. I'm just telling you. How many of you actually? I know I've had hunters in here and stuff. Who are hunters? Yeah. So you know how to do this, but you don't want to cut too deep because you don't want to open. You don't want to cut into any organs. The first thing I want you to isolate though is the diaphragm, that dome-shaped muscle. And I don't know if I had an award I would give it. I'll think if I can think of something. I want to see that diaphragm and see if you can actually remove it intact. It's like a beautiful fan. And if you're not careful when you're cutting, because it attaches here to the lower part of the sternum, doesn't it? If you're not careful when you're making that first initial incision and you cut it, you're laying open like a book that you hold open, you're going to mess up your diaphragm. Let's see if you can remove that first. Challenge accepted. Okay. Then, did I tell you, did the intestines look like human intestines? No. But the liver kind of does. They're not going to have gallbladders, but the liver kind of does. The spleen kind of does. The stomach kind of does. The kidneys do, right? But what I'd like you to do first is to crack that sternum and open up that rib cage and sternum. And after you've done that, I want you to decapitate them. When you decapitate them, you're going to see an opening. When you look from a superior view, you're going to see the opening of the trachea. And then you're going to tease down to it because it's tiny. The little muscular tube behind it's the esophagus. But you're going to take that trachea and try to tease it out, keeping your blade away from it toward the backside. Tease it out, because if you can, you're going to be able to lift the trachea, lungs, and heart out all together as one. Right? Then you're going to go to the abdominal cavity and see if you can get the kidneys, the stomach out, and the intestines out, kind of as one. You'll see the kidneys. If you have a male, you can dissect the testes. Okay, so take a break and then come on over to the lab so I can get back there.